In the last 500 years, Filipinos have fought for freedom, unity, and equality. We have made our mark in many fields, from science and medicine to culture and the arts. We are beacons of creativity, resourcefulness, resiliency, and compassion. In 2021, the Filipino people will join the world in commemorating one of the greatest achievements of mankind, the first circumnavigation of the world. We celebrate this historic achievement by bannering an important message. Over adversity and struggles, we shall triumph, putting humanity first, always.
Bigyang halaga, wag hatakin ng pababa. Isipin wag sana ang sarili lang, pakisama't bayanihan. Subukan nating isulong at ligawan ang magandang bukas. Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo sa lubungin ng kinabukasan. Pag-amin ating lahi, mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon. Halina't hawakan ng aking kamay, sabay abutin natin ang tagumpay. Patuloy lang tayo sa pagpapanday, tiwala sa Diyos ang sandat at gabay. Subukan nating isulong at ligawan ang magandang bukas. Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo sa lubungin ng kinabukasan. Pag-amin ating lahi, mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Fernando Santiago of the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and I am the host of today's webinar. Welcome to the countdown to the 500 online lectures, a special program brought to you by the Office of the President and the National Quincentennial Committee in anticipation of the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. 1 hour isn't enough given the caliber of our distinguished speaker, so I will try to keep this introduction very short. This is a series of online lectures in celebration of the upcoming 500th anniversary of the victory at Mactan, the Philippine part in the first circumnavigation of the world, and other related events in 2021. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, the Presidential Communications Operations Office, Radio-Television Malacañang, Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Education, and the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. We are live via Facebook through the pages of the National Quincentennial Committee, the NHCP, the NCCA, DFA, DepEd, and the DLSU-SEARCH. Now, please don't forget to share this live stream to your friends and like NQC's Facebook page. Follow at NQC 2021 on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to their YouTube channel, National Quincentennial Committee, for more educational materials. You may also follow the playlist on Spotify, 500 Years Philippines, to access the official soundtrack of the Quincentennial Commemorations. Now, just a few reminders. You may view this lecture and earlier lectures on the Quincentennial online lecture portal. This is very important. If you wish to receive a certificate for attending this webinar, you need to sign up to the portal at portal.nqc.gov.ph. So let me repeat. To receive a webinar, please sign in or register through portal.nqc.gov.ph. And you need to view the live stream from there. Our webinar today is the 13th in the series, Countdown to 500 Online Lectures. Please check the portal for the earlier lectures. Now, we will have an open forum at the end of the lecture by our distinguished speaker. And at any point in time, for the participants in Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. And for those who are not joining us in Zoom, you may send your questions through the comment section of the live stream in the NQC portal. And the NQC team will relay to me your questions. So we will accommodate your questions at the latter part of the lecture. Now, before I introduce our speaker, let me give an overview of the lecture. The title of the lecture is The Indigenous Thrives in Us. What does indigenous mean? Did 1521 result in a total loss of connection with our indigenous culture in the Christianized lowlands? Did 1521 cut us off from the indigenous religious practices of our Southeast Asian neighbors? The lecture proposes that instead of looking at the indigenous as tribal or as the non-Westernized, we go back to the Tagalog word katutubo, that which is locally rooted. People in the Hispanized lowlands are just as locally rooted as those in the unhispanized uplands, such as the Cordillera. The strong indigenous tradition in the lowlands succeeded in so localizing Christianity that we can speak of a Filipino version of Christianity as shown by the ecstatic dancing, the quest for potency, and the family-centered morality. At the same time, this localizing process finds parallels in other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Java. Their indigenous religious traditions resemble ours. There too, it succeeded in localizing the imported religions of Buddhism and Islam. So this is the abstract of our speaker's lecture, who I now have the pleasure to introduce. Our speaker obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities and a Master of Arts in Philosophy from the Ateneo de Manila University, with specialization in phenomenology, and also a Master of Arts and a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Hawaii. He is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Ateneo de Manila and heads the Cultural Heritage Studies program at the same department. A writer of multiple books and other publications, he also regularly teaches a course on the anthropology of Southeast Asia. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fernando Nakpil Zialcita.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernando. Oops. Just a minute. I would like to thank you, not only you, but I want to thank the National Quincentennial Committee for inviting me. And I would like to start by greeting Honorable Salvador Medialdea, who chairs this distinguished committee. I would also like to greet my friend, Dr. Rene Escalante of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. I would like to greet everybody for spending time listening to this lecture. So the title of my talk is Indigenous Thrives in Us. Habang naglalaba ang asawa ko sa sapa, pinapalo niyang damit. Recalls a farmer who lives in a barangay on the foothills of Mount Banahaw. Hindi niya namalayan na nasagi pala niya ang asawa ng tikbalang. Dahil doon, nakasakit siya at namatay. Trekking through the forest of Banahaw, our guide cautions us to please observe silence, lest the spirits dwelling in the surrounding environment be offended and punish one of us with a bad fall. Is it only in this legendary mountain that the spirits seem alive? Friends in Lawag and Vegan tell me that to avert mysterious illnesses that never seem to vanish, they offer atang, that is food offerings to the unseen spirits of the house, which can be their ancestors or dwarves. How about in Metro Manila? People relate that they avoid buildings that are isolated and surrounded by trees with long shadows. Some avoid working alone in their office after 6 in the evening because unusual things have happened, like an electric fan whirling by itself. Better to pack up and work in a restaurant, safe in the company of other living people. There's a widespread conception that we are so westernized that we have been uprooted from our indigenous culture and that we can find indigenous only in the non-Hispanized areas of our country, Cordillera, Sierra Madre, the uplands of Panay, and Mindanao, whether Lumad or Muslim. This is unfortunate because educated lowland Christian Filipinos feel divorced from their roots. They think they're wholly westernized. At the opposite extreme, because educated Filipinos do not know the indigenous tradition, they tend to romanticize it. Because of this divorce, educated lowland Christian Filipinos feel embarrassed when relating with our neighbors in Southeast Asia because they think our neighbors have retained their culture while we have not. So this is the question I want to raise. The central question is, what does indigenous mean? Corollary to this would be these other questions. Did 1521 really mean a loss of connection with our indigenous culture? Did it cut us off from the indigenous religious practices of our Southeast Asian countries? How do we conceptualize the relationship between the indigenous and the foreign in our culture? So what I'd like to do would be examine what indigenous means from an anthropologist's perspective. To interpret the encounter between the indigenous and the Hispanic as an interplay, paglararo between cultural traditions. And propose that the interplay between traditions is an ongoing process as well among our Southeast Asian neighbors. Hindi lang sa atin, sa kanila din. So here are the topics: the indigenous in us, the interplay of the paglararo between the indigenous and the foreign, parallel interplays elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So let's talk about the indigenous in us. In Tagalog, katutuwa literally means locally rooted versus that which is imported. This is more exact than in identifying indigenous with tribal or with non-Western. It's important to realize that the word for indigenous in Malay is orang asli. It's never applied to Muslim Malays, only to peoples in Malaysia that until recently were hitherto animist. Because Islam, like Christianity, was formerly an import from the Near East. In fact, both Islam and Christianity share a common heritage: the Old and the New Testaments, Greek philosophy, and Roman technology like the Ark and the Dome. We think of the mosque as having a characteristic architecture of the dome. But where did the dome come from? It was the Romans who invented it. Then they passed it on to the Byzantines, who headed the Eastern Roman Empire. The capital was Constantinople, which later became Istanbul after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks at the close of the 15th century. So throughout the Islamic world, the dome is the characteristic feature of mosques, and that is from the Romans. Even Hinduism and Buddhism were not indigenous to Southeast Asia originally. Both originated among the upper castes of India, who belonged to the same language family as Iranians and Europeans. The word for God in Sanskrit is Deva, from which we got the word Diwata in Tagalog. In Latin, God is Divus, from which we got Deus, Dios, and divine. So the thing though is both Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam have been here longer than Christianity, so we tend to think of all of them as indigenous, which is not the case. So what was pre-Christian, pre-Islamic religion like? Let's take a look at it. First of all, there was reverence towards the spirits of the ancestors and nature spirits. So unusual rocks, strange trees like the balete, or mysterious animals like the crocodile were revered. Food offerings were made to them. Its concern was really fertility, health, and prosperity through sacred rituals. So a chicken could be sacrificed and its blood shed. If the sick person was of high status, the victim could be a human being. The aim of life was to enter the afterworld with high status, to be buried with all of your possessions, such as porcelain, gold, and slaves, because your position in the afterworld depended on your status in this life. The shamans who presided were generally women, and they invoked the spirits and allowed their bodies to serve as a medium. Morality that did not center on a broader abstract community, rather it centered on promoting the welfare of the. And here we can see the connection. Ecstasy was very important in indigenous religion. And we can see, in fact, it still is prevalent in the shamanic rituals, for example, of the Panay uplands as recorded by Dr. Landa Hocano. And this comes out clearly in our Catholic processions such as Ati-Atihan or sinulog, or ubando, or turumba. There's a lot of dancing. And it's true the friars allow this, but these dances are definitely not of Spanish Catholic origin. Now they're still Catholic because generally there's the priest who presides over these processions with special mention of Jesus and his mother. In an essay on the contradictory responses of Umabon and Lapu-lapu to Magellan, the former offering of acceptance and the latter rejection, Nicokin says that we are both Umabon and Lapu-lapu, both Christian and pagan. A second way in which our indigenous religion continues to influence Catholicism today is the concern of many, not with spiritual salvation, but with physical salvation. Safety from harm, illness, material want. Observing the Catholic Tagalog's worldview, Niels Mulder, a Dutch anthropologist, concludes that this worldview resembles that of Buddhist Thais and Muslim Javanese, and can thus be said to be truly indigenous and pre-Western. Mulder lived in Thailand, Indonesia, and has been living in the Philippines for the past decades. He speaks and reads Thai, Indonesian, and Tagalog. I shall discuss the Thai and Javanese cases later on. For now, I shall focus on the Tagalog. If you look quickly at two of the biggest religious spectacles in our country, the Black Nazarene Procession of Quiapo and the Our Lady of Peña Francia Festival in Naga, we find that Mulder's observation is correct. Salvation in Tagalog is kaligtasan. It can denote either the spiritual, freedom from sin, or the physical, security from all physical harm. I'm sure that for the millions of men who compete with each other to be able to draw near the sacred icon and touch it with a towel, what they're concerned about is not really liberation from sin, but rather the desire to ensure their family's physical well-being. When we interview the devotees, we find out consistently that they participate despite the hardship because of a panata, because of a crisis in family, like, for instance, a loved one is seriously ill. So the clergy may insist on kaligtasan as freedom from sin, but many Filipinos find the physical meaning more relevant to their lives. Of course, in Catholic theology, the holy statue is just a representation of the living saint. But I get the sense that for many, the statue itself exudes power, more so when it is brought around in procession. In popular belief, an anting-anting or agimat becomes truly potent when the seeker is willing to endure pain and hardship in attaining it. During the procession, the icons emanate more power. The devotees make themselves worthy of it through hardship. Another example, the flagellants in Central Luzon. Several of us scholars have interviewed these flagellants, and uniformly, we have found out that they whip themselves bloody, not because of kasalanan, despite what media is insisting on, but because a close relative had an emergency or had an accident. Always the concern is to secure the safety, the kaligtasan of the kin, rather to atone to God for sin. The concern with potency clearly underlies the food offerings and the ilocos. They're offered to placate the powerful invisibles. It also underlies the ecstatic dancing that accompanies a procession, because the ecstasy invigorates the self. So the question is, why does the indigenous continue to thrive in the lowlands despite 350 years of Spanish domination? We know that the goal of the Spaniards was to promote the Spanish Empire's official ideology, Catholicism, in order to ensure unity of thought and feeling. So what has been happening? Well, it's true the missionary tried to bring his parishioners together in the nucleated plaza settlement centering on the church and the plaza. Bajo las campanas, under the church bells, This did not happen. Farmers found it more convenient to live close to their fields and to the water sources than to live in a compact town from which they would have to walk some distance to their fields. The result is what we see today in Ilocos, Quezon Province, and elsewhere. There's an imposing church with government offices in the poblacion, surrounded by schools, the market, and residences. But there are also plenty of small hamlets, the Nayon, the Purok, the Sitio, separated from the town center by wide stretches of fields, groves, and often poor roads. So how much influence would the missionary have exerted over the Nayon? It is notable that in Ilocos and Quezon Province, even today, it is not easy to catch a ride from the poblacion to the distant Nayon, and harder still to catch a ride back. How about in the town proper? The historian Bruce Shank studied town life in 18th century Samar and showed that the Franciscan parish priest's ability to influence people was limited. The real powers were the leading families of the town. Of course, unlike the parish priest of today, the missionary could call on the soldiers for help in stamping out practices that threatened the Catholic religion. But in those days, the remoteness of many of the hamlets would have been an obstacle to what the parish priest wanted. So given this context, the pre-Hispanic, pre-Christian indigenous traditions would continue while adapting to the new political reality. We must also realize that the Catholic Church itself did consciously adapt to its new context. It's true the Catholic Church is strict about doctrinal purity, but it has adopted and reused pagan beliefs and practices. For instance, Christmas is celebrated not during springtime, when most likely Jesus was born, but on September 25, the feast of the sun god in pagan Rome, when much feasting and gift-giving took place in the middle of winter. So it allowed dancing in Philippine processions under the supervision of the priest. There's another reason also why the Indigenous has thrived. Christianity was taught in the local languages. Not in Spanish. It was taught in Tagalog, Ilocano, Waray, Cebuano, Hiligaynon, Kinaraya. So language is a very important vehicle for culture. Okay, so which brings us now to the third observation. Another way in which the Indigenous continues to animate our worldview today. Poulder notes that, like the Thai and the Javanese, Catholic Tagalog morality centers on maintaining the social order, with the family and especially the mother at the core. Because the outside world is seen as unruly, the nuclear family provides a safe haven for the individual. Within the family, the individual is expected to respect roles that have been prescribed by tradition. As a dutiful self, as a dutiful child, the self follows and does not question the order of things. It subordinates its own needs to those of the family. The assumption is, by being a good son or daughter, one learns to be a good citizen. At the core of this moral order is the mother, who is extolled for her sacrifices and concern for her children. It is to her that the self runs, even when an adult, rather than to the father to seek comfort and guidance in times of crisis. This is so apparent in our epics. Mothers in our epics, for example, Lamang or Labadongon, are so powerful. Let me just cite the epic of Labadongon. Labadongon is an epic from the uplands of Panay. It centers on the captured hero, Labao Dongon. His two sons, Asumanga and Boyong Baranugon, want to rescue him from a giant who has imprisoned him. So to whom do they turn for help? to their grandmother, the goddess Aluncina, and she tells them how to kill the giant. So powerful talaga. Catholicism introduced devotion to Mary, also considered powerful because she's the mother of God. But there was something more that Mary had, namely that she's vulnerable because her son was crucified before her very eyes. For many Filipinos, therefore, she is attractive not only because she's privileged as an intercessor, but also because she's seen as a fellow human being, a mother grieving over her son. So how do we conceptualize the relationship between the indigenous and the foreign? The indigenous tradition, I would say, localizes Christianity by rooting it in people's deepest concerns. At the same time, Christianity universalizes the indigenous by connecting it to a worldwide organization and to super-local morality. What do we mean by that? What Christianity has done is it invites us to think beyond our family, to think of a wider community beyond the family, so that our morality is not focused on the family, but on the larger community, the good of the town, the city, the country, mankind. Christianity also asks us to think even of people to whom we have no kin ties. So in that sense, it universalizes the indigenous. The interplay as well as the tension continues to this day in us. Naglalaro pa rin yan dalawa, katutubo at ang Kristyanismo naglalaro sa atin hanggang ngayon. So I would like now to talk about the parallel interplays among Thais and Javanese. I would like to talk about kaligtasan, salvation in Buddhism. Let us turn to Thailand. Gautama Buddha's foremost concern was with teaching his disciples how to lead a life of compassion and freedom from suffering, because unfulfilled desires lead to frustration and hence to suffering. So how can the self attain selflessness? Gautama proposed an eightfold path, wherein by orienting behavior and attuning the mind, the disciple discovers that the everyday world is made up of illusions. So that is how to gain enlightenment, to realize that our everyday concerns are just illusions. Eventually, the disciple should attain enlightenment and to transcend desire. So nirvana is not necessarily a place, it's really a state of enlightenment. But what has happened in Thailand? The paradox is that popular religion in Thailand prioritizes desire. Buddhism gained wide acceptance during the 13th century when the kingdom of Sukhothai was founded, which is the founding core of Thailand's political unit until now, because the Thai monarchy dates its origins to the kingdom of Sukhothai. Previously, people revered the spirits of nature, such as those of the sky and the ancestors. Amulets, talismans, fortune-telling, magical healing, instant merit-making warded off danger. They also conferred power. Through mediums, spirits offered guidance to the living. All these indigenous elements persist in the Buddhist umbrella today. Now, people had been expecting that a purer form Buddhism would emerge in the late 20th century, but the reverse has happened. Bangkok, according to Patanakit Yarsa, a Thai anthropologist who was my student and whom I used to accompany to the countryside, has become the center for spirit medium cults, thanks to heavy migration from the rural area. The Buddha, who never thought of himself as God, is revered as a supreme deity presiding over a hierarchy of gods and spirits. The relics of deceased monks are revered as amulets. while their spirit can possess the minds and bodies of mediums. Other spirits that can possess mediums are the spirits of the forest, sacred animals such as the white elephant, and important historical figures. Hence, while the Buddha urged transcending desire, amulets advertised in the internet promise beauty, love, fertility, success in gambling, and luck. Let us turn to Java. Islam preaches a very strict monotheism. Salvation in Islam is about entering paradise through submission to the will of the one God. The believer must believe wholeheartedly that there is only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, or more particularly, his messenger. He must shun the false gods that are invented by the evil one. During the 13th century, Islam came to Southeast Asia in its Sufi version, which sought union with God through meditation rather than from mere external prayer. Before we go that, let me just point out that in Islam, salvation is attained by following the 5 pillars, and of which the first is the foundation. Okay, so let's go now to the Sufi version. The Sufi seeks union with God, or Allah, through meditation, rather through external prayer alone. Ritual is not enough. Now, what is interesting about the version of Sufi Islam is that it tolerated other paths to the one God, even if these other paths were non-Islamic. And this was very helpful to Islam because when it entered Sumatra and Java, it encountered Hinduism, Buddhism, and animism. To give an example about the toleration of Sufi Islam for nature spirits, there is a very popular nature spirit that's still revered throughout Java, Rora Kidul, Queen of the South Seas. In fact, there is a beach hotel, Samudra, on the southwestern coast of Java, which has a hotel room specially designated for her. It's her bedroom. She has a gown there and portraits and their offerings. There's a bed. When you enter, you'll be overcome by the intense scent, the essence of roses. Her portraits show her as a beautiful woman with hair flying in the wind and in a gown with bare shoulders. Beside her is a golden sea dragon. Very un-Islamic. The only thing Islamic about her is the color green. Now, Javanese Muslims turn to her for help with offerings of food and batik. In central Java, they have a custom called slametan. It's a ritual meal to which immediate neighbors are invited. What is the purpose? To mark an event in the life cycle. For instance, birth, circumcision, wedding, or to ward off spirits. Because as a villager explained to the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, Islamitan protects you against the spirits so they will not upset you. And spirits are numerous. They linger about in the woods or in lonely spots. Interesting that, okay, so Muslim villagers believe that invisibles join in and partake of the food, which is similar to the Ilocano belief about the atang. So what do they do during the meal itself? First, they recite Islamic prayers, then the food is shared, and then it concludes. Now, these accommodations with nature spirits were tolerated by Sufi Islam. However, within recent decades, fundamentalist Islam decries this as un-Islamic and seeks to eliminate them. The parallel I see in Christianity's fundamentalist Christianity demands strict adherence to the Bible and rejects any accommodation with local tradition. From these cases, we see that we share with our neighbors indigenous religious practices that revere the spirits of ancestors and nature, that value protective measures against unruly spirits, and that values fertility and prosperity. The role played by this indigenous religion vis-a-vis imported religions is varied. In Thailand, this indigenous religion has transformed Bangkok into the center of spirit medium cults for the entire country. In Java, after centuries of tolerance by Sufi Islam, a stricter form of Islam has now come in and seeks to remove all of this. In the Philippines, the former hostility by the Catholic clergy has in recent decades been transformed into toleration. On the other hand, fundamentalist Christianity aims to excise all crypto-pagan beliefs. So let us conclude now. I would like to point the following. Christianity, more particularly Catholic Christianity, entered the Philippines as the handmaid of Western colonialism. However, the pre-existing indigenous religion localized it, just as surely as the pre-existing indigenous religion in Thailand localized Buddhism, and in Java localized Islam. There is indeed a Filipino Catholicism, but just like Thai Buddhism and Javanese Islam, it is rife with tensions. So, what do we do then? Which way to go? How to ensure that Christianity be locally rooted while remaining true to its universal vocation? Or should we even speak of retaining Christianity? These are questions that can only be resolved by us. Thank you. My lecture is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zialcita. So it's now time for the open forum. Well, a reminder to our participants, you may type in your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box for the participants in Zoom. And for those who are joining us through the NQC portal, you may type in your questions in the comments section. So I will kickstart the open forum, sir, with two questions. The first one concerns the concept of indigeneity. Okay, so you talked about the indigenous, but I'm curious about the understanding of the indigenous or indigeneity in the context of levels. Is there like to what extent can one be indigenous, or how local can indigeneity be? So is there such a thing as indigenously Southeast Asian or even just indigenously Tagalog?
Now there are levels. Definitely the farmer in Banahaw or the farmer in Ilocos has less foreign influence, whereas we in the city have more foreign influence because of our education. But even in the city, there are levels also because, so in Ateneo, like I suppose in any university, takot pa rin sa mga empty buildings or lonely trees. But we don't sacrifice chicken when we have a car. But on the same road, Katipunan, you'll find that tricycle drivers slaughter a chicken and spill its blood on the tricycle. So there are levels. It's the same thing also in Thailand and Java. There are levels of indigeneity. Probably more educated are more open to sim. Pero naghahalo pa rin the indigenous is still there.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now, my second question concerns the other concept that you also mentioned. So you talked about the universalizing effects of Christianity and Islam. But at the same time, you mentioned how the indigenous forces localizes these religions.
Yeah.
So Well, I'm sorry, I'm a historian, so I'm not an anthropologist, and I hope you can enlighten me on how what I somehow see some kind of a contradiction, or are these forces that are constant? While there is a universalization, there's also an indigenization happening at the same time.
Yes, there is a tension. It's a
Mhm.
tension. Authors of the tension, that has to be decided by every generation.
I see.
There's no formula.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mm.
So, are there any questions from our participants in Zoom or in Facebook? So, please feel free to type it in. So we have, we have a question from Andilyn Simeon. And the question is, what are the possible implications of indigeneity in Christian or religious education?
Oh, ako, for one thing, I would like to see more of the indigenous discussed. Kasi it's true that the indigenous element is very strong, but it's not really articulated in our educational system. It's not highlighted.
Mhm.
Kasi as I point out, we think we're so westernized, no? But we don't highlight. And for one thing, I would like to hear mention of the beliefs that we have in the spirits around. I think they should be discussed in the curriculum, but it's not. In the same way, for example, Europeans are familiar with the gods of Rome and Greece. I wish we should also be familiar with the gods of our ancestors
Mhm.
and the implications. Wala eh.
Okay. So, sir, we have a question from Almozol. So I'll just read what he wrote in the chat box. Good morning, Dr. Zialcita and everyone. Almozol here from the Theology and Religious Education Department of DLSU. Thank you for your sharing. One key point that resonates with me is your academic confirmation on how mothers, from an indigenous point of view, serve as the foundation of the moral order in the family.
Yes.
I see this as an extension of shamanism. One of the most memorable lines from PCP2 documents is the phrase, "The Philippines is Christianized but not evangelized." I wonder if such statement is largely from a male-centered, clerical perspective of the Catholic Church hierarchy. But given the strong connection between Filipino mothers' spirituality and the moral exemplar of the Blessed Mother as protector, intercessor par excellence, may we hear your comment on how indigenous, such as an observation from the church?
Ito lang. To be honest with you, I have feelings of ambivalence too about the role of the mother. Definitely importante to give the mother an important role to acknowledge. But what I see sometimes in the Philippines is the mother tends to shield the child from all possible criticism. It doesn't allow the child to mature, to grow, to develop its own personality. So that's a problem. I'm a little ambivalent about it.
Right. So the questions are coming in. The next question comes from an anonymous attendee. Is it possible to bring back these indigenous cultures, even if Christianity still persists and controls how many still live? Also, are you somewhat spiteful of how history has treated indigenous culture?
I really wish we would be more aware of Ijanale and Lumawig and Labao Donggon and all the gods and goddesses of our ancestors. They should be part of the curriculum.
Okay. So the next one is from Yutse Young. And the question is, did missionaries also participate in the process of localizing Christianity in the Philippines? Were all of them fundamentalist Christians?
No, kasi may tension within Catholicism. Doctrinal purity is important. But at the same time, Catholicism itself has a history of accommodating local beliefs and practices. Remember, the cult of Mary was actually not originally a part of primitive Christianity. It grew as Catholic Christianity spread through the Roman Empire. It came across devotions like the devotion to Mater Dea, the Mother Goddess. So Christianity, or Catholic Christianity, adopted this and developed a theology to accommodate these encounters with the Mater Dea. So, ganun lang. I mean, it's a natural process. So there has this intention, and I pointed out, operated into our processions because Spanish Christianity itself is very kinetic. Religious festivals in Spain revolve a lot of rite, which involves dancing in the church. Of course, not to the same extent as in the Philippines, but the celebrants of the ritual dance from the portal of the church to the high altar. But of course, nothing to resemble the color and sheer ecstasy of our ati-atihan and sinulog and turumba. Plus, then I mentioned the fact that Catholic Christianity was preached in the vernacular, so that would automatically localize, or would tend to localize, because language is an important vehicle for transmitting culture. The word atang, for example, how they translate that? It's Ilocano. So it resonates so much because it's passed on directly from the ancestors down to us today. Atang.
Okay. So the next question is from Andilin Simeon. Is the strong, unconscious, clannish, tribal, and familial mentality blocking us from attaining true Filipino nationhood?
Yun ang malaking problema nga. How do you combine, on the one hand, a strong devotion to the family with allegiance to the nation? That is a big problem in the Philippines. I don't think it's one or the other, because definitely the family is important. It gives security and safety to the individual self. But at the same time, we also have to think of the wider community, namely the nation, the bansa. But how to combine both is the problem, because it's much easier to prioritize something you can feel concretely, namely your family, than to think of the wider community, namely the bansa. The problem.
Okay. So the last question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is the last question. Oh, sorry. We have two questions. But the one I'm going to ask is from an anonymous attendee, and it's a bit personal in nature, so you may refuse to answer if you wish. Do you personally adhere to any religious tradition or any of the indigenous religious traditions?
Well, I'm a Catholic, okay, but I consider myself a liberal Catholic, and I love these indigenous traditions personally. I love them. Yeah, that's why, together with Hilda Cordero Fernando and Father Francisco Demetrio, a Jesuit, we wrote a book, The Soul Book, an introduction to Philippine pagan religion, to familiarize Filipinos with the indigenous tradition. Because I think it's possible to combine both a love for the indigenous tradition of our ancestors, as well as a love for Christianity. It's a tension. Ganun sa buhay. Sometimes, how do you resolve this tension? You have to resolve it, I think, on a personal level.
Mhm. Okay, sir. I think when I mentioned that there were only 2 questions, the others decided to suddenly send their thoughts. So I suddenly, I have a few more in line, and since we have around 8 minutes remaining, I hope you don't mind if I ask the questions nonetheless.
Yeah.
So the next one comes from another anonymous attendee, and the question is: in my field work in the province, people tend to give roles to saints outside of that given by the church. We even call saints ina or ama. Can this be
Yes.
considered an indigenous belief?
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Naging miyembro ng pamilya yung santo. By the way, I didn't mention in my speech the fact that we Filipinos like to have big statues of saints that we keep in our houses, especially the Santo Entierro. Now, this is rather unusual from the Spanish Catholic perspective because in Spain or in Mexico, you do not keep large processional images at home, especially in the bedroom. These are kept either in the church or in the cofradia, the confraternity. But here, we keep them at home. Even the statue of the dead Christ is kept at home and is called Ama. And I find this such an interesting connection with our indigenous tradition because according to the missionaries Pedro Quirino and Francisco Alsina, after the Datu was considered sacred, died, his body was embalmed and kept in the innermost part of the house. Okay. Together with all the jewelry and the weapons and other sacred belongings of the family. Now, it's so interesting that today, Filipinos still keep the Santo Entierro in a bedroom, kuminsan in their own bedroom. And this is brought out in procession for the rest of the community to revere. That's never done in Spain or Mexico. That's another example of indigenization. So in other words, the dead Christ or San Roque or Inang Maria are considered members of the family. Members. Before were kept in the house in the form of bones as protective beings who would protect the house from harm.
Okay. So the next one comes from Mia Ebalio. Should the Catholic Church in the Philippines apologize for its harsh way of converting the natives, like the annihilation of the Babaylans?
I think so. All the way, definitely. I mean, Christianity naman is all about admitting your sins, your failings. It should.
Okay. And the last 2 questions, okay, since we only have around 5 minutes remaining. Should a person from one indigenous ethnic or tribal background be learning about the cultures, practices, and traditions of another, even if he or she does not accept them due to religious biases?
Definitely, I think if you want to build a bansa, we have to learn from each other. We cannot be stuck only in our own local tradition. You have to learn from each other.
Okay. And for the final question, sir, it comes from Aldous Tracy Rubio. Like what the speaker said, there is such a thing as Filipino Catholicism that is congruent to the description of Falan, which has elements of the indigenous and the Western. Would this then be the evolution of Western Catholicism or the destruction of traditional pagan Filipino traditions?
That is a question we have to resolve today. How much of our indigenous tradition shall we retain? Is it congruent with our morality today? Because we should realize there are elements in our indigenous tradition which are not necessarily congruent with the wider morality. I pointed out the tendency to focus only in the family, to the denial of the wider community. That is a big problem. So, pero kailangan pag-usapan yan eh. I don't want to give prescriptions. Kailangan pag-usapan.
So thank you, sir, for addressing the questions. I found the questions to be very difficult to answer, quite frankly. Unfortunately, this is all that our time permits. And before we end, I'd like to remind our participants to please fill out the evaluation form that you will find through the site of the NQC. Okay, the portal .nqc.gov.ph. Okay, and I think you can also find the link in the Facebook page of the NQC. So on behalf of the National Quincentennial Committee, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, the Presidential Communications Operations Office, Radio-Television Malacañang, Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Education, and the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research and Hub, I'd like to extend our most sincere gratitude to Dr. Fernando Zialcita for sharing his expertise and for addressing the questions that were asked. This has truly been a very thought-provoking and enlightening webinar. And to our guests, thank you for joining us. Again, you can view a recording of this webinar on the portal of the National Quincentennial Committee. So thank you and have a nice day.
Mandirigmang